Okay, everyone. So, if in the last video, what we really tried to do is give sort of an overview of Leibniz's sort of biographical information, as well as sort of his conception of God. For this video, we're going to fill that in a little bit more using some of the readings that we have encountered to this point. Leibniz is a very subtle thinker, and a lot of his sort of nuances ultimately come from criticisms of his contemporaries, right? And so a lot of what we're doing today is sort of situating Leibniz with respect to his contemporaries. And he did a lot of kind of fun stuff for this. Like he wrote a lot of dialogues, for example, with some person with a Greek name supposed to be himself that's normally like love of wisdom or the love of truth or something like that, right? And sort of like putting his own philosophy constantly in conversation with his contemporaries, which sort of produces this thing with Leibniz that's really, to me, very interesting, which is sort of that Leibniz a lot of the time will sound like a sci-fi futuristic alien sometimes. And we're going to see that especially next week whenever we talk about his conception of what substances are or monads. Today, we're going to do a little bit less of that. Unlike, say, Spinoza, right? The Ethics is a huge book. We don't even have the ability to cover all of it, even though we spent multiple weeks on it, right? We didn't even get through half, ultimately at the end of the day. So for Spinoza, you have somewhere to turn where it's like, oh, this is his master work. This is where he writes everything. This is like his philosophical system as he gave it at the end of his life, right? We have that sort of a text for Descartes, right? Or sorry, for Spinoza, right? And to some extent, we have that for Descartes too, right? We have the Meditations, which is for Descartes the most important text that he ended up writing, and gives a basically full account of his whole philosophical picture. For Leibniz, we don't really have a text like this. Leibniz didn't really write out one single book that was sort of like his entire philosophical system. Instead, you get it in these little fragments. You get it in him refuting a specific point in another philosopher, him having these back and forth. He has like some kind of the most ridiculous like voir in terms of like he wrote so many people so much. Like the amount of letters that we have of Leibniz sending back and forth with philosophers is really extraordinary. But as far as his own published material, it's typically like small little journal articles and stuff like that. The closest things that we have really to a full account of his whole philosophical system are things we're going to read next week. And so this week we're sort of getting our footing. We're getting the groundwork for what kind of motivates Leibniz's thinking. Where did he think that his sort of contemporaries had made a mistake? And so to begin that discussion, we're going to start out with a text I assigned called Conversation Between Philarete and Aristide. This is one of those fun little dialogue things that Leibniz wrote. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, but for some reason I find it very cute. Like all of the 18th century niceties of like having like this aristocratic conversation, or whatever. I don't know. It's just kind of fun to me for whatever reason. It's a little bit silly and to some extent pompous, right? But it also has a certain amount of charm to it too. It's like it's a very earnest sort of genre of philosophical literature. So in that way, I think it's quite fun. But in order to get the full picture out of this text, you have to understand that one of the characters, let me double check, namely Filarete, is sort of Leibniz's mouthpiece, whereas the other character, Aristi, is more of a figurehead for one of his um, opponents, namely this guy I've written here named Malebranche. Now, a long time ago, sort of Malebranche was read as part of sort of like the rationalist lineage. He's sort of like a philosopher that comes after Descartes. A lot of people describe his philosophy as Cartesian because he accepts that there are two fundamentally different kinds of substances, right? And a lot of Malebranche's philosophy ultimately comes from remarks that Descartes makes in the sixth meditation. I don't expect you to remember this, but at some point in the sixth meditation, Descartes says something like, "Oh, well, the interaction of bodies can be an occasional cause of our thoughts." And what he means by that is like, so say I, am looking at this mug or whatever, right? So what Descartes is trying to say there is that in some sense, right, we can say that the mug is the cause of my perception of it. Various features of my perception of it are tied to how the mug is itself, right? But various other aspects of the mug and how it appears to me are solely the result of my brain, right? Like the fact that that it has colors, right? For example, right? And so the mug is an occasional cause in the sense that it provides the occasion for my soul to produce the representation of the mug, right? So this is what is meant by an occasional cause, is that the mug itself is not sufficient to cause my perception of it. Various aspects of my perception actually stem from myself, right? But, it plays some sort of important causal role for bringing about the representation that Descartes at this point is just happy to say occasional cause, right? And so what Malebranche does is Malebranche really expands on this idea, right? It's the sixth meditation, which is supposed to be about the relationship between the body and the soul, right? And it seems like this is sort of an answer to that question to some extent, right? The body provides the occasion for the soul to arrive at a representation. And so this is how mind-body interaction works. Now, what Malebranche says, okay, well, what if we just said that God himself intervenes on each and every mind-body interaction? So what that means is basically what Malebranche says is that for every mind-body interaction, there's a miracle that is incomprehensible to us that is God directly linking up the body and the soul, right? Or the body and the mind, you might prefer to say instead. So this is what occasionalism is that the ways that bodies and minds interact is that bodies provide the occasion for a change in the mind, and that God is the one who actually causes their interaction. That interaction is otherwise not possible by the finite entities themselves. And so this is sort of the way in which Malebranche is sort of Cartesian, right? Is he still accepts Cartesian dualism, he accepts Cartesian interactionism, right? But then he says, we need more than Descartes gives us. We also need this conception of God as sort of like directly intervening into human events anytime that there's a mind-body interaction. Okay, so this is who he's talking to, right? And just in the way that there's a tendency to sort of see Spinoza's work as almost inevitable outgrowth of Cartesianism, so too it is fairly typical in this period to conceive of occasionalism as a sort of necessary outgrowth of Cartesianism, even if Descartes didn't expressly hold this doctrine. Well, why? Well, because in the Principles of Philosophy, which all of these philosophers were very aware of, Descartes kind of moves in that direction whenever he says, oh yes, in every kind of finite substance ultimately depends on God, right? So you can kind of see where Malebranche sort of gets this direction from Spinoza. You can kind of see that moment in the Principles of Philosophy is really anticipating someone like Spinoza, for example, like claiming God is the absolute substance and the cause ultimately of all finite substances, or the essence of all finite substances. Okay. And so by having a dialogue with this character who comes to represent Malebranche, it's sort of Leibniz's opportunity to engage in a dialogue with Cartesianism as a whole. And sort of the primary problem that he brings up in this conversation is what I've written down here as number 2, the problem of composition. So the problem of composition goes like this. Ultimately, the problem of composition concerns Descartes' claim that bodies are finite substances whose essence is extension. Right? This is classical Cartesian claim. What Leibniz is going to say are that these two features of bodies are incompatible. If bodies are defined in virtue of their extension, then bodies are always composites, which means that they're made of various parts, right? So for something to take up a certain amount of space, right, you can draw that here, you could always potentially divide it in half, right? And importantly, this is an essential dimension of Descartes' conception of bodies, because this is what renders bodies suitable for a mathematical analysis, right? It's precisely because the essence of bodies consists of an extension, which is something mathematically quantifiable, that it becomes possible to engage in natural science, right? It becomes possible to mathematically quantify amounts of force, right? It becomes mathematically possible to arrive at more complex sort of predictions. Now, what Leibniz says is basically that Descartes has to give up on the idea of bodies being substances in order to keep the insight that an essential dimension of bodies is that they are extended. Why? Okay, we're going to go through the thinking that happens in the Principles of Philosophy, especially about bodies as a finite substance. So what makes bodies a finite substance is that they're a substance because they don't depend on other finite substances, right? But they're finite because they still depend on God, right? And so for Descartes, what makes a body is it depends on God and nothing else to exist, right? Um, you can imagine the mug again, right? This specific sort of, I don't know, shape of matter, right, can exist even if all of the minds in the world disappeared, right? It would still be a mug. It would still take up a certain amount of space, right? And so from this, for Descartes, you can conceive of the separability of the essence of extent, the essence of bodies as extended from the essences of minds as willing, judging, thinking things, right? Okay. Now the problem of composition states that, okay, well, if the criteria for being a substance is that you do not depend on other finite things, right? What about the atoms and molecules that make up this mug? Right? Doesn't it seem plainly like the substance of the mug ultimately depends upon the various atoms and molecules and so on that constitute it, that it is composed of, right? Because it is exactly Descartes' conception of bodies as extended that allows us to think of them as a composition, right? It's composed of all of these, atoms and molecules or whatever, and we can cut it up, right, and separate them. And so what this means for Leibniz is that bodies are not substances, right? They are composites. And, Spinoza had a lot of reasons for why composites couldn't be substances. But ultimately, it comes down to this, right? If you're a composite, then you're made up of stuff, right? And if you're made up of stuff, that underlying thing is the substance, not the aggregate of them. They can always be divided, they can always be separated, they can always potentially be added, right? All of those things are ultimately, for Leibniz, so I'm just going to write this up here, is phenomenon. In other words, we see these aggregates as being unified, right? But they have no essential unity, right? They can be dissolved, right? And so, in other words, bodies just concerns how the world appears to us. It doesn't concern its fundamental underlying reality, right? It only concerns aggregates, right? And how aggregates interact with one another. And those are going to be mathematically quantifiable, but not, importantly, as finite substances. And so ultimately, I believe the most important the most important argument in the conversation here is Leibniz's claim that bodies cannot be finite substances because they are composites. And the nature of a composite is incompatible with the nature of a substance. We're going to learn a lot more about what Leibniz conceives of as substance and why Leibniz sort of conceives of substance as being almost these infinitesimally small atoms, right, that make up bodies. We're going to talk about that more next week. But for now, it's important to know why Leibniz is different than Descartes and Spinoza. He's different from Descartes because he's going to say that there's not two kinds of substances. There's only one kind of substance, and that is mental substance. And he's going to say this next week. And I'm going to say against Spinoza, it's not the case that there's only one substance. There's an infinite number of substances. And they're all going to be individual minds. Okay. So that's the conversation. We're moving a little slowly, but so we're going to try to pick up the pace a little bit, but we're not going to rush. Okay. I'm probably saying this more for me than for you. Okay. Primary truth. So if you'll recall from the previous video about Leibniz's conception of God, Leibniz believes that God always acts for reasons. And so this is one formulation of what I've written down here we might call the principle of sufficient reason. And so what that principle means is you can take any truth, any event, any fact in the universe, and you can provide a satisfactory, aka a sufficient reason for why it is exactly that way and not any other way, right? Like one thing about human beings is that we're imprecise, right? Our perception is constantly confused, right? If I look out onto a beach, right, I can see a beach, and I can see that the beach is composed of so many grains of sand, right? But I cannot clearly and distinctly conceive of all of the sand. It sort of becomes a blur, right? Insofar as I'm thinking of it as the beach. But God is completely unlimited, right? God sees perfectly and in every aspect and in every dimension, every fact about every event, fact, truth, etc. about the universe, and knows exactly why it is one way rather than another. And so one reason why Leibniz is so important for the history of philosophy is the discovery of this principle that seems in many ways obvious if you reflect on it. Like, oh yeah, of course there's a reason for why everything in the universe is the way that it is, right? But it's important to contrast this sort of standpoint with like what you might find like in an ancient Greek standpoint, right? For the ancient Greeks, at least a lot of the time, they conceived of the gods as similar to human beings, right? You can act arbitrarily, you can act in anger, be overcome by emotion, right? Be filled with vice, even, right? Um, and so there are some events in the universe from the ancient Greek standpoint that are sheer contingencies, right? It just is this way. There is no underlying order or reason for why. It just, that's just the nature of fate, right? Is that it's bound to be one way rather than another, but human beings can never know about it, right? And ultimately, there is no reason behind all of this kind of stuff, which is part of the bitter edge of Greek tragedies, is the fact that the hero always takes on sort of his fate. You can think about Oedipus, who, on the discovery, of his actions, plunges out his own eyes, right? And this sort of like makes them so tragic is that they are sort of like taking on in a personal way the indifference and the sort of blind chance that sort of belongs to the universe, right? In Leibniz, this is all gone. In Leibniz, it's not that there are multiple gods and they're at war with one another and they're finite in all of these ways, right? There's one absolutely perfect God who conceives of every possibility and it has a reason for why the world is exactly the way that it is, down to the absolute most minute detail. You can approach it from any level of scale, right? You can approach it at the level of macroscopic objects and asking why they are what they are and why they interact the way that they do, right? You can ask it at microscopic objects. Did I say macro? I don't know. You can ask things that sort of like at the anthropological level, like why are human beings the way that they are, right? Why does the world look like how it does, right? And sort of Leibniz's contention is that if you could embody the perspective of God, you would know the exact calculation that God made to prefer our world to any other possible world. And there is a reason. There's always a reason. This is an essential dimension of Leibniz's metaphysics. But this is also, and we'll see more about this in a minute, exactly why Leibniz's framework is so suitable and so amenable to a modern natural scientific standpoint. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But for now, we should think about the primary truths, as Leibniz defines them, as the truths that must hold in any possible universe. In other words, these are metaphysical laws. They are laws that govern all kinds of possibility and laws that are co-eternal with God, right? And a lot of the time, these sort of laws are going to strike us as obvious, and for Leibniz, that's kind of good, right? Because for him, that's a confirmation that these laws underlie all of our thinking already, right? It should not be a huge surprise to us that we consider many of these obvious, because Leibniz is saying these are the laws that underlie everything real, right? So of course you follow them. You already know them already, right? All you need to do is reflect on what you already believe and you will arrive at these, right? One example is, of course, the principle of sufficient reason, which is that everything has a reason for being exactly what it is. And Leibniz's proof of this is that for two things to be different, they have to have some predicate that makes them different, right? So, like, these two markers are different because they're differently colored, right? There's one predicate that one has, being blue, that the other one doesn't have, that's red, right? And then you can also list out several other predicates, right? Like one is in spatial location A and the other is in spatial location B, right? If you're God, then you would know even at the extremely minute level, like this one has this many number of atoms. This one had, questions like that you would be able to answer. That obviously at our human level we can't. Another sort of primary truth is that wholes are bigger than their parts, right? This whole mug is bigger than a part of the mug. We can know that just through knowing what a part and a whole is, right? And that's going to be true of anything that exists. And so for Leibniz, a priori demonstration, he's just trying to get you to reflect on laws that govern obviously what you think, but also everything that exists and everything that is real. And that you can do that. You can sort of build proofs for them and show that they must be true a priori. A priori means independently of experience. right? So it's not like I could go out into the world and confirm the principle of sufficient reason through an experiment, right? Instead, what Leibniz is trying to say is that these are the assumptions, right, that any sort of physical system, any sort of like experiment or, appeal to experience or anything like that already presumes, right? And so any proof that would not be an a priori proof would be begging the question, right? Because, like, in the case of the principle of sufficient reason, for example, right? Um, you could go out into the world and be like, oh, I'm going to discover that there's a cause for whatever event, and then I'm going to generalize, right? But the whole point, but you would never be able to reach the justification that allow you to hold that as a metaphysical principle, right? That you are justified in always presuming that there is a reason or a cause behind everything that exists, right? And so I'm going to go fairly briefly just because I'm already well over time. But this also lets us understand and appreciate Emily du Châtelet's Foundations of Physics. Emily du Châtelet was an important scientific figure. She was the first person to translate Newton into French, and that translation is so well esteemed that it continues to be used today. Um, she was one of the foundational scientific minds of her era. And in this book, The Foundations of Physics, basically, Du Châtelet is trying to explain how Leibnizian metaphysics is the foundation of physical inquiry, especially Newtonian physical inquiry. And essentially what she has to say concerns especially the principle of sufficient reason and something that we're going to call the law of continuity. So the principle of sufficient reason says there's a reason for why everything is exactly the way that it is. And what the law of continuity then says is that for a change to occur, it must occur continuously through the system that it's a part of. So let me draw a little picture here. Maybe I'll just erase this right now. Okay, so you're doing physics, right? You're examining the velocity of a ball rolling down a hill, right? And what the law of continuity says is that for any individual, what the principle of sufficient reason says is that for any specific point along the line, you can ask, why is the velocity of the object what it is at that point, right? And what the law of continuity says is that for any increase, say, in the velocity of the little rock or ball or whatever, that it will increase continuously, right? So it'll go from, say, 7.8 meters per second to 7.9 meters per second. And then to go from 7.8 to 7.9, it went through 7.81, etc., right? And so there's never any point where there's a breach, right? Where there's an absolute gap that happens in nature that you can't sort of like apply continuous mathematical models in order to make sense of, right? And so what Du Châtelet is really doing, which is part of what Leibniz wanted with his metaphysics, is she's trying to say that these are the assumptions that any and all scientific experiments must make, right? They must presume these things in order for any of their reasoning about how physical events occur to be valid, right? And this is kind of how Leibniz also always thinks about primary truths, as he thinks of them as suppressed premises in an argument, right? It's like your argument is valid if you assume the principle of sufficient reason is true, the law of continuity is true, and so on and so on. All of the primary truths. What he thinks about is all the metaphysical laws and all the mathematical laws, right? Um, and so basically what he's saying is all arguments presume these things, right? But they don't justify it, right? And if you took these things to be false, then none of our reasoning would be valid, whether that's about physical events or philosophical arguments. These are the presumptions behind all of our thinking. And so you can see then why he's a rationalist, right? Is because the ultimate foundations of our thinking are discovered through a priori inquiry, right? And there are laws that sort of reign over the physical laws that can be discovered through the senses or other means. Okay, I hope you like this video. Gonna have to end it there because we went over time a little bit. Hope that's okay. I hope that you're all doing well, and I'll see you all for the next recording.